it's occurred to me that for communion, many times in my ministry I have spoken from Philippians chapter 2, from this passage, which is theologians call the hymn of Philippians. In the original, in the Greek, it's actually written in meter, like a song. And it's one of the most beautiful passages in the whole Bible. So I told you we're going to do a number of unusual things this morning. And I was also raised in a church where it was called responsive reading. So I'd like us to read this responsively. That means I read a verse and then you read a verse. We go back and forth. I'll read the black ones. You come back with your radio voice and read the blue ones. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus,
who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped,
but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness.
and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross.
Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name,
That in the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth.
and we can all do number 11 together. And every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Very good. You were so good, we ought to do that more often. So, even though I said many times I have spoken from this passage for communion, because it just totally applies, it dawned on me that I've never gone on to why Paul put this in Philippians. It wasn't there just for itself. We could say, well, that's our Jesus, that's the way he is. But Paul's conclusion wasn't just for us to stop there and recognize how wonderful Jesus is, but that the members of the Philippian church were to be like him too. And members of all churches were to be like that, the spirit that's in that passage. And the central point in all of that about Jesus, in one word, is his example of obedience. His obedience to the will of the Father for his life. And that's why, without a pause, Paul goes right into verse 12 in chapter 2 and says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, to work out your salvation with fear and trembling." So this whole example, supreme example of obedience, is there for us to follow, not just to say how wonderful Jesus was at it. Why was it necessary for Paul to be saying this to the Philippians? Because there were problems of self-centeredness among them in the church. Why? Because they were human, just like all the rest of us. And so there are principles here that apply to every one of us, and things that we need to be very careful of continuously addressing. He started even before that passage we read back in chapter 1 in verse 27, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Because there were those among them that were not conducting themselves in a matter that was worthy of the gospel. They were not being good examples of how Christians ought to be. And the thing that causes this is pride. The big I, me, mine. This is how we all came into this world, and it's what God is having to constantly deal with us for the rest of our lives. But it should be getting better. As Connie shared in the Sunday school class, her father was one of the most godly person I've ever known in my life, and I had the privilege of him discipling me. Not to say I've turned out much like him yet, but he was in his 90s when he said to Connie that he was still working on this. And that leads me to think I got a ways to go myself on the big I. And it comes up again before the passage, just before it, what we read. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Now he's talking to Christians here, he's not talking to unbelievers. But in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interest of others. There was selfish ambition among them. Those who felt that they had the right to self-appointed authority on how things needed to be done in the church. In almost every church, at some point in that church's history, this pops up stronger than other times. In fact, someone gave me a book that was for pastors a number of years ago. A pastor who's going to be, he may be an experienced pastor, but is going to be the new pastor moving into a new church. And the author said, one of the first things he needs to look for, who is Jack in the congregation? Because Jack is most likely the person, he may not have a title, he may not have a position, but Jack is the one who really runs the church. And the pastor needs to find out who Jack, sometimes it's Jackie, if it's not Jack. And they may be good people, but they somehow feel everything has to be done according to their criteria. And very often it's because they're really good people, and they have poured themselves into that church. But it's a very subtle thing. We can begin to think that we assume that with that we have ownership and we have authority. We need to understand authority is given, it's not taken. And sometimes it's not even Jack or Jackie, it's just the members who have been there the longest. And the reason this message is very important is that we are a growing church. You wouldn't know it this morning on the 4th of July. If everything just sort of stayed the same and it was the same number of members all the time, this wouldn't be an issue. But when it becomes an issue is when God starts growing the church and new people are coming in. And there are those who have been there 20 years who may not have even served much, but they assume it's an us and them attitude. And you haven't paid your seniority yet. You don't have the authority. We do. You know what? There's nowhere I find that you grow in authority because you've been in a church for 20 or 30 years, that you have any more authority than anyone else. I've looked in our Constitution and bylaws. I don't find it there. What I do find is that the longer we've been in the church, we grow in responsibility. People want to grasp for authority and have the right to say how things ought to be done a lot more than they do on grasping for responsibility. The responsibility of moving in the same mind and attitude that Jesus demonstrated in what we just read. That's what we're supposed to be growing in. And this is something we all need to be very careful of because it's so subtle. And we're supposed to be shining as stars, is where Paul's going here, but that tarnishes our star. And we need to examine ourselves and take whatever steps are necessary to prevent this from happening. This can even happen to the people in leadership who do have titles. There are pastors, because they've been pastoring a church for so many years, assume they own the church. When we took the church over in Paraguay with a handful of people that eventually went well over 100 people. After we left, they had problems. And there were those who said, "Pastor Harry, come back, take it over, save us from our problems." I said, "I never owned the church. I never owned the church." You're going to have to start acting like elders with your new pastor, seek God, and find solutions. I don't own it. There were no strings attached. I'm glad to say that they did, even after a three-way split. But afterwards, all those leaders came back together and forgave each other. They said, "Well, at least there's 3 churches instead of 1 now." One theologian on church growth wrote, sometimes for God to plant more churches, there have to be church splits, but it's not the recommended way. And it certainly isn't. And those things happen because of carnality. Carnal, self-centered, ambitious Christians who think that everything has to be done according to their criteria, when what we ought to be doing is making room for new people, making room, and seeing how we can serve them. I've had brand new people come up to me and say at different times, "How can I serve?" I had to grab my seat. How can I serve? Haven't heard that for a while. Of course, there's people that do without having to say it. Thank God for them. But this other mentality is what I call squatters' rights. That because someone has been somewhere so long and even served, this unconsciousness that they now own things. There's nothing in the Bible that talks about that, but it talks a lot about growing in responsibility. And this is why Paul goes on in Philippians 2:14-17, "Do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault, in a crooked and depraved generation." Otherwise, we're acting just like the crooked and depraved generation, only religiously, "in which you shine like stars in the universe, as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ, and that I did not labor for nothing." And even over into chapter 4, "I plead with you, with Euodias." I'll pronounce it my way, you pronounce it your way. "And I plead with you, Sotachi, to agree with each other in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, loyal yokefellow, help these women who have contended at my side in the cause of these gods." These are people who are in leadership. They weren't just recent converts. I probably told you the story years ago when we were in Argentina. It was a church of maybe 250. I was leading communion, and there were two women who were leaders. One was in charge of the orphanage, who was a very key person in the work, the orphanage that was related to this church, and the other who was involved in the orphanage, and both very strong personalities, but both wonderful women who served, I mean, endlessly, but they weren't even on speaking terms. And I'm in the middle of this, we're worshiping, and I just kept the worship going. I said, Lord, how can we go into celebrating communion with these two women of God with this attitude that they won't even speak to each other? I said, you got to do something. So as we were worshiping, the presence of God came in, and I watched. One was in that corner, one was in this corner, because they didn't even want to be near each other. And I saw them cross in the sanctuary and come up and wrap their arms around each other and ask forgiveness. Now, did they stop being strong personalities? No. But they took that I and bent it into a C for Christ. It takes humility. It's not easy for any of us, but it's the only way. We have to humble ourselves, not only before God, but before each other. They weren't shining stars. That's why Paul's telling them what they need to do to become shining stars. Get the tarnish off. Probably not many of us use lanterns anymore, but you probably noticed that lanterns can get smoked up inside. What happens when that happens? Not much light comes out. It gets worse and worse. Do you know why the smudge forms in a lantern? It's not from the flame, it's from the wick. And we are the wicks. The only purpose for the wick is to draw the oil that is to give the flame. But when the wick gets involved and there's no oil coming, you get smoke and it blocks the light. And when our egos get involved in what God is wanting to have happen, it's not His Spirit that's reflecting the light. It's smoke from our self-centeredness. Now, I'm being pretty straightforward in this message. I'm not sugarcoating it, because Paul didn't sugarcoat it. He said they were to address this with fear and trembling. That's the level of priority that he was putting on it. This is one of the top priorities of the thing that he was addressing them about. Philippians 2:13, coming back to that. For it is God who works in you to will and to act according to that purpose. Work what? I mean, if we're going to read this, we need to know what is God trying to work. The humility and obedience of Christ in us with respect to each other. See, it's easy to think about it of my humility and obedience if it's just God. But how this really plays out is between you and me. This is the reflection. This is where the rubber meets the road. But we skipped explaining a phrase in verses 12 through 13. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good pleasure. This phrase is hardly ever properly understood. The usual explanation for this is that it is talking about our salvation experience, and that it's up to us to cooperate with God to fulfill His purpose for our lives. Let's see, do I have that there? That's the usual explanation. Now, I want to say that that is a truth. That statement in itself is true. We do need to cooperate with God because He has a specific will, purpose for each of our lives. But that's not what Paul is talking about in this verse. He's talking about something else. Furthermore, if that was it, it would be totally out of context with everything we've been reading up till now and everything that comes directly after it. Paul has not changed the topic to talk about us finding God's purpose for our individual lives. What causes the confusion is not about referring to thinking this is about our born-again salvation experience. The word that is used for salvation here is the same word in the Greek as in Acts 27:34, when Paul was on that ship that was going to be shipwrecked, and the sailors weren't eating, and Paul tells them, eat something, and for your health. That is the same word that's translated salvation here. In fact, the different versions of the Bible say for your survival, for your nourishment, for your health, for food. Paul is telling the Philippians to be deliberate in addressing these problems among themselves for the health of the church, the spiritual health in the congregation that had been seriously out of whack in the Philippian church. A lot of times we miss this because Paul's words are so gracious and so beautiful going into this. And he is gracious, but he is dealing with a very serious problem of spiritual pride, which is the basis of all of this. Also, the word for your and your salvation is plural. It's not you individually, your salvation. It's your health. It's talking about the whole team, everybody together in that church. This matter is so serious. That is why he said in verse 12 to do this with fear and trembling. This has to be a top priority for them to obey. In other words, if we are aware that there's anything in our spirit that is not in line with this humility, Paul is saying you need to do something about it now. It's not something you put off. You go to that person, you put things straight. Because it's going to affect the spirit of the church, and something further, I know from experience, it opens the door to the enemy. It lets the enemy get a foot in the door of that church and start wreaking havoc. Frankly, I don't know how some Christians can even participate in communion when they haven't put things right with their brethren, and sometimes even with their church leadership. When they have complaints, he talked about complaining. That was the big sin in the Old Testament that God had with Israel. Their constant complaining and murmuring. Now, when someone has a complaint, there's nothing wrong with that. If you go to the person that it's supposed to be expressed to. I don't know if any of you ever saw the movie Saving Private Ryan. The reason I saw it is I wanted to know what my father went through in World War II. But the soldiers are going along with the captain. They're in Germany, and they're grousing and griping. And finally, one of them says to the captain, "Captain, don't you ever grouse?" He said, "Yeah, I grouse, but I grouse up. You don't grouse down. You don't talk to people about your complaints who I can't do anything about it anyway. You talk to somebody who it corresponds to." You know, a lot of times when we're complaining about things in the church, it's like the assumption is that the leadership are deliberately doing things wrong. Do people really think that we in the leadership deliberately try to do things wrong? We're open to suggestions. When I was dean of men at the Bible school, I used to, once a week, the dorms were divided up between different buildings. Once a week I'd have a meeting with the guys, called it a hall meeting, and I'd say, "Okay, this is your chance. You want to gripe, you want to complain or say anything, you can say it to a leader. Just try not to use profanity. And feel free to say whatever you want." Well, on this one occasion, this guy Noah, who had quite a temper anyway, he had quite a background. We found out later he raised money for his first year at Bible school by selling drugs. Then he felt convicted about that, so the next summer he just worked as a bartender. But he still had quite a temper. And in that dorm, which we called the Tab, when Elam Gospel Church was first starting, they used the tabernacle of the Bible school until they got their own building built. Well, the basement was the dorm for guys, one of the men's dorms. Well, it created a lot of inconvenience because on the weekends people were using their bathrooms, and they had to put up with it. But then the church moved. And so in this meeting, Noah, it's totally unfair that we have to keep following, and he named these different rules, and it's extremely inconvenient, and the other dorms don't have to put up with this. So I just let him vent. So I said, "Okay, Noah, what I want you to do is write me a letter. Get together with your RAs, maybe there's even more complaints. Write me a letter and put it in what you think is wrong and how you think things ought to be done. And I will take it to what was called Operations Committee, the president and the other deans." So he did. So I came back in the next meeting and I said, "Noah, they accepted everything you had to say. Instead of having groused about this for several months, if you would talk to the people that are correspondent who could do something about it," what happened was they forgot to change the rules after the church quit using this building. No one was trying to deliberately make your life miserable. But I hope this is a lesson for you, someone who's going to be a leader someday, on how you address problems spiritually and not carnally. This is what causes divisions in churches. I'm glad to say I did Noah's ordination back in Michigan a few years later, and he's a wonderful pastor somewhere right now. But you see, to humble ourselves is to run the risk that we won't look as important as we were or think we were, and that we won't have the control that we think we ought to have. When one knows that they have contributed to the problem with their comments, actions, or attitude, they go to the person or persons and apologize. There are some people, Christians I've known in my lifetime, I have to ask myself, have they ever apologized to anyone in their life? That is not a very high level of integrity. But they can still high-five the other members when they come into church and participate in communion. I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. There's no fear and trembling of the importance about this with them. And as verse 13 comes out to, so that was not the right interpretation of what this is talking about. But in verse 13, For it is God who works in you to will and to do according to his pleasure. This is what he's trying to work into us. This attitude of Christ that we read about. Now, Paul isn't speaking here as a dictator to them. He's speaking as a father. And I'm speaking as a father. Because it's for the health of the church. That is why he addresses them as my dear friends. And in Philippians 4:1, therefore, my brothers, you whom I love and long for, my joy, my crown, that is how you should stand firm in the Lord, dear friends. This is the heart of this message, but it's also extremely important because I firmly believe this church is going to grow. And are we going to make room for people, or are we going to have an us and them attitude toward them? Us and them is not God's approach. And I end with this illustration of, because he told them, he commended them for being obedient when he has been with them. It's another thing to follow through when no one's looking over your shoulder. And years ago, there was a group of U.S. Army Rangers. They were already Army Rangers, already highly trained. But they wanted to select the cream of the crop among them for an extra special, dangerous assignment, mission. So they sent them to another school that was also highly disciplined. But no one checked to see if their uniform was spotless every day, that they left their barracks in perfect condition or not. No one looked over their shoulder. And then at the end of the course, those who were selected, people were watching, but they didn't know it. The ones who were selected were the ones that followed through on doing everything in order without having to be watched. When there was no sense of the presence of the person they were accountable to, they did it on their own. This is what Paul is saying to the Philippians now. If you're going to shine like stars, you're going to have to move into a new dimension of obedience. Obedience isn't an on and off switch. It has to begin somewhere. It begins at salvation, but then it has to grow. It has to mature. I wish it were a one-time project. I'd be the first in line. But it's not even just an ongoing thing. We have to grow in it. It has to be repeated. Connie on her china cabinet has stuff that's silver, but as you know, silver tarnishes. Now that's her job, but let's suppose Connie gave me the job to have to polish the silver. Well, she'd show me how to do it, and she'd say, all right, Harry, it's time, polish the silver again. So I always do it, but say she's going to go away on vacation. And am I going to polish the silver when she's not there looking over my shoulder and to remind me to do it? Paul doesn't want to have to remind the Philippian church to follow through. It's more than once in your life you have to take the big I and turn it into a C. This is to be the spirit of communion whenever we celebrate it and whenever we move into it. So the worship team can come back and I will lead in prayer. Father, we thank you for this word. And even as one of the choruses we sang this morning was that we would be willing for you to speak whatever it was you had to say. And we know that this word is very serious. And I begin with myself. show me if there are areas of tarnish in my life where I think I have unconsciously taken ownership of anything that has to do with your kingdom and your people. And if it is, that I will have the humility to go to those people and humble myself and apologize and say that perhaps even what I said was right, but I did it with the wrong attitude. Lord, let the Spirit of Christ, the mind of Christ, here in Philippians 2, saturate every one of us individually, our families, and this congregation in a growing way. Help us to address this with the importance of fear and trembling, because we are going to have to give an account to you someday. In Jesus' name, amen.